Hi, welcome back to Teaching His Story. This is Dr. Brenda MacMenamin, and today we're going to talk about how to be free from government control or Socialism 101. And we're going to use a reference that I love that is in the middle of my economic integrity book for high schoolers. And it's on page 89. It's The Law by Fredrick Bastiat. He wrote this in 1850, so that's 172 years ago. Isn't that amazing? When France was going socialist, and he was waving the flag to say, we're going the wrong way, and this is why. And he refuted some of the socialist lies and deceptions in such a fantastic and concise way that it is well read still today. Isn't that amazing? So it says here on page 89 in the intro, it says Mr. Bastiat was studying and explaining each socialist fallacy as it appeared. And he explained how socialism must inevitably degenerate into communism. But most of his countrymen chose to ignore his logic. The hard part about refusing socialism, when it creeps in this way, okay, so there's two ways that socialists, communists, Marxists can take over a country. One is through revolution, which is violent, okay, think Russia, those countries in Europe where they just flooded in with their people and assassinated whoever was in control. And it was bloody, it was ugly, it was violent, there was scare tactics, terrorism. But they said they were going to take America without firing a shot. And so that's called socialism by evolution. So they start with painting this utopia, and it appeals to our sin nature. Okay, so you may not be a Christian. You're still welcome anytime you want to listen to what I'm saying. But I'm speaking mainly to Christians so that you can be aware. The word tells us to not be ignorant of Satan's schemes. Okay, so this is what he's using. And they make it sound so wonderful, like it's going to be some utopia. But the only way it can be enacted is if we acquiesce to a system of mammon. Do you remember what Jesus said? You're going to serve God or mammon. And the root of that word is avarice. Okay, so avarice is greed. It's envy, jealousy, covetousness. And you know, as if you've read the Bible even one time from cover to cover, God hates covetousness. He wants us to work. If a man will not work, neither let him eat. It says in, I believe it's 1st or 2nd Thessalonians 4:10-12, to mind our own business and work with our hands so that we don't have any needs. So it's quite a Christian concept to work hard for the glory of God, for our own needs, and then to be generous with our money to share with others, okay? So he's starting out talking about the law. And I'm on page 90, okay? So I'm going to kind of tell you where I am in my book. If you want to buy it, you can go to teachinghisstory.com and look at the economics course, and you'll find a link to it there, okay? But what he's saying, to start out, he says, the law perverted and the police powers of the state perverted along with it. The law, I say, not only turned from its proper purpose, but made to follow an entirely contrary purpose. The law become the weapon of every kind of greed. Instead of checking crime, the law itself guilty of the evils it is supposed to punish. So then in the next section, it says, we hold from God the gift which includes all others. This gift is life. Physical, intellectual, and moral life. But life cannot maintain itself alone. The creator of life has entrusted us with the responsibility of preserving, developing, and perfecting it. In order that we may accomplish this, he has provided us with a collection of marvelous faculties. And he has put us in the midst of a variety of natural resources by the application of our faculties to these natural resources. We convert them into products and use them. So then he says, life, faculties, production, in other words, individuality, liberty, property. This is man. And in spite of the coming of artful political leaders, these three gifts from God precede all human legislation and are superior to it. So he says, life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. Okay, let's go down to the next section. He says, what then is law? It is the collective organization of the individual right to lawful defense. So it is a corollary if God tells us to be a good steward, if he's told us in Genesis 1:28 to rule the earth and govern it, that we must be able to defend what he's given us, okay? So that's very well developed by people way smarter than me. So he's launching from there. He says each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of any one of them is completely dependent upon the preservation of the other two. So he develops this concept that we're allowed to defend our life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or property, as he calls it here. And that is what law is the right to restrain injustice. And so he's developing this in a very eloquent way. Okay, so I'm going to trot on down to 92, and he talks about a just and enduring government. And then he talks about the perversion of the law. And what he's saying in that first line there, law by no means confines itself to its proper functions, and when it has exceeded its proper function, it is not done so merely in some inconsequential and debatable manner. And he says at the bottom of that paragraph, it has converted plunder into a right. So let me back up a little bit. The law has placed a collective force at the disposal of the unscrupulous who wish without risk to exploit the person, liberty, and property of others. It's converted plunder into a right in order to protect plunder. And it has converted lawful defense into a crime in order to punish lawful defense. So he's explaining that law can be used unlawfully, and that's what tends to happen. And he says on page 93, the law has been perverted by the influence of two entirely different causes: stupid greed and false philanthropy. So he's going to talk about the first, and he says, if everyone enjoyed the unrestricted use of his faculties and the free disposition of the fruits of his labor, social progress would be ceaseless, uninterrupted, and unfailing. But what happens is, he says there's a tendency that's common among people. When they can, they wish to live and prosper at the expense of others. We see that in the garden with Cain and Abel, don't we? Immediately that Cain is jealous of Abel. And so it says, when does the plunder stop then? And he explains that plunder is that desire to seize and consume the product of the labors of others. Okay, so he says, when does that plunder stop? And he says, when it becomes more painful and more dangerous than labor. And that's what the law is supposed to do. It says in Romans 13 that it's supposed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Okay, 1-5. He's saying right here, it's evident then that the purpose of the law is to use the power of its collective force, okay, all of us coming into community, to stop this fatal tendency to plunder instead of to work. All the measures of the law should protect property and punish plunder. Those are the two purposes of law. Then picking up on the top of page 94, he says, thus it is easy to understand how law, instead of checking injustice, becomes the invincible weapon of injustice. It's easy to understand why the law is used by the legislator to destroy, in varying degrees among the rest of the people, their personal independence by slavery, their liberty by oppression, their property by plunder. This is done for the benefit of the person who makes the law and in proportion to the power that he holds. And so this is really interesting. He says that when people are plundered, then they have different reactions. They can either stop the lawful plunder or they may wish to share in it. And if they stop it, then we can have a free civilization. If they want to participate in it, then we're sliding into socialism, communism, Marxism. Does that make sense? So it's really us, we the people, who are going to decide which way we go at this point. And he says the results of legal plunder, he says in the first place, on the very last line of 94, it erases from everyone's conscience the distinction between justice and injustice. He says no society can exist unless the laws are respected to a certain degree. The safest way to make laws respected is to make them respectable. That's rather deep, isn't it? He says the law of nature is to maintain justice. There is in all of us a strong disposition to believe that anything that is lawful is also legitimate. And that's why, especially as Christians, when we read the Bible and we deduce principles and we apply them to our lives and to our civic duties, we should know that we are not to be covetous, envy, jealous. We are not to use a system of avarice, which is the system of mammon, which is socialism, communism, Marxism. Does that make sense? So as Christians, we have the responsibility to refuse what's being offered to us for free, but's actually by the sweat of another man's brow. Wow. Isn't that good? That is super good. So then he goes into different philosophies and philosophers of the time, and I'm going to skip through that so that I'm not making this too long. But let's trot over to page 97, and he says the answer is to restrict the law. And he says in that second paragraph, in fact, if law were restricted to protecting all persons, all liberties, and all properties, if law were nothing more than the organized combination of the individual's right to self-defense, if law were the obstacle, the check, the punisher of all oppression and plunder, is it likely that we citizens would then argue much about the extent of the franchise? So if law is used lawfully and it's consistently lawful, nobody's going to complain. It's when we start seeing some people benefit that it's literally trying our souls to see how we're going to respond to that. So he says the fatal idea of legal plunder, that first paragraph. But on the other hand, imagine that this fatal principle has been introduced under the pretense of organization, regulation, protection. Aren't these sounding familiar? Or encouragement. The law takes property from one person and gives it to another. The law takes the wealth of all and gives it to a few, whether farmers, manufacturers, ship owners, artists, or comedians. Under these circumstances, then certainly every class will aspire to grasp the law, and logically so, and use it unlawfully is what he's saying. Okay, so let's trot down over to page 99. And he's talking about two kinds of plunder, legal and illegal. So, of course, illegal is illegal. That's somebody just out and out stealing, okay? But what he's going to address is what's called legal plunder. But what he means is using the law to plunder. It's not truly legal in God's eyes, okay? So he says, but it does not always do this. Sometimes the law defends plunder and participates in it, Thus, the beneficiaries are spared the shame, danger, and scruple which their acts would otherwise involve. So trot down to how to identify legal plunder. But how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. Wow. That's pretty simple, isn't it? That's when you know somebody's really wise, when they make all this complicated stuff really simple. So then trot down on page 100 to legal plunder has many names. I'm just going to read this because it is so good. Now, legal plunder can be committed in an infinite number of ways. Thus, we have an infinite number of plans for organizing it. Okay, here we go. Tariffs, protection, benefits, subsidies, encouragements, progressive taxation, public schools, ouch, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed profits, minimum wages, a right to relief, a right to the tools of labor, free credit, and so on. All these plans as a whole, with their common aim of legal plunder, constitute socialism. And this is what they're teaching our children in school. So it doesn't matter how much you love God if you're ignorant of this system. You've got to educate yourself and repent from it, or we will be not a sheep nation, but a goat nation. It is that serious. Does that make sense? I want you to go to Teaching His Story and look up the post and answer me. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. I really do want to hear from you. So, socialism is legal plunder. He says socialists desire to practice legal plunder, not illegal plunder. Okay, so they're making plunder legal, but it's not really, is it? Socialists, like all other monopolists, desire to make the law their own weapon. And once the law is on the side of socialism, how can it be used against socialism? So he says in that next paragraph, let's trot down to 102. In that second paragraph, he says, now it must be said, when justice is organized by law, that is by force, this excludes the idea of using law, which is really force, and George Washington said that, to organize any human activity, whatever, whether it be labor, charity, agriculture, commerce, industry, education, art, or religion. The organizing by law of any one of these would inevitably destroy the essential organization, justice. For truly, how can we imagine force being used against the liberty of citizens without it also being used against justice and thus acting against its proper purpose? And what's even more seductive, and this is what he goes into next, is using the law in a philanthropic way. And the minute he goes into this very eloquently, and he goes into different philosophies and philosophers of the time, but as soon as you use taxation and government money to promote anything that's good, you're taking money from one group of people and using it for a specific group of people. That's socialism. You can't get past it. You cannot use the law to promote good. It's got to do two things. It's got to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Read Romans 13, 1 through 5. It makes it very clear, okay? And so then he talks about three systems of plunder: protectionism, socialism, communism, and just makes the case that one will slide into the other. We've heard that from many very wise people of our day. And then on page 104, he talks about the law is force. Since the law organizes justice, the socialists ask why the law should not also organize labor, education, and religion. So he says, why should not law be used for these purposes? Because it could not organize labor, education, and religion without destroying justice. It's not blind at that point. It's not equal at that point. We must remember that law is force, and that consequently the proper functions of the law cannot lawfully extend beyond the proper functions of force. Isn't that fascinating? This might take you a few times of listening to it to get it. When I first heard this, it just got all jumbled up in my brain, but give yourself time to reflect on this, because this man has an incredible amount of wisdom. So he's talking about the law and charity, and basically saying the same thing over and over again, different ways. You cannot use the law for charity, because you're taking what belongs to one group of people and giving it to another group of people that haven't worked for it. So it's not theirs. And he talks about the influence of socialist writers. That's on page 107. And 108, he says the socialists wish to play God. But they really believe that they're smarter than the rest of us. They do not think you can govern your own life. And so there is a real temptation, especially if you've had a hard time like we've had recently, for people to trade liberty for security and receive that government money. And, you know, at one point it was even put right into our bank accounts, wasn't it? So we've got to start throwing off that idea. We've got to start seeking God and asking Him to give us the power to get wealth and refuse the socialistic system of mammon. Then he's talking about the error of socialist writers. And then he goes in on page 118. What is liberty? Let's trot down here. He says, actually, what is the political struggle that we witness? It is the instinctive struggle of all people toward liberty. And what is this liberty whose very name makes the heart beat faster and shakes the world? Is it not the union of all liberties, liberty of conscience, of education, of association, of the press, of travel, of labor, of trade? In short, is it not the liberty, the freedom of every person to make full use of his faculties, so long as he does not harm other persons while doing so? Is not liberty the destruction of all despotism, including, of course, legal despotism? Finally, is not liberty the restricting of the law only to its rational sphere of organizing the right of the individual to lawful self-defense, of punishing injustice? Amen. So then he goes again into philanthropic tyranny, how people want to use the law to give stuff to people, and you cannot do that unless you take it from someone else. So he goes again into the arrogance of the socialist. He addresses different philosophers of the day, talks about the vicious cycle of socialism and the concept of liberty from the socialist viewpoint. So basically he's mocking them for wanting to manipulate us constantly, and how the enormous power of government is used to plunder instead of to just bring defense, to punish the guilty and protect the innocent. So he says on here on page 128 at the top, he says, but I do not hesitate to answer. Law is the common force organized to act as an obstacle to injustice. In short, law is justice. Isn't that good? I got to catch up here on my, I've got the book up here too. So this is interesting because he says, on the bottom of page 28, he says, the law is justice, simple and clear, precise and bounded. Every eye can see it, and every mind can grasp it, for justice is measurable, immutable, and unchangeable. Justice is neither more than this or less than this. If you exceed this proper limit, if you attempt to make the law religious, fraternal, equalizing, philanthropic, industrial, literary, or artistic, then you will be lost in uncharted territory. And now it's really not uncharted. We see it's doomed to failure. So he goes again into communism, how socialism goes into communism. And he says at the last page, on page 32, he says, God has given to all men that is necessary for them to accomplish their destinies. He has provided a social form as well as a human form. And these social organs of persons are so constituted that they will develop themselves harmoniously in the clean air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers, away with their rings, chains, hooks, and pincers, away with their artificial systems, away with their whims of governmental administrators, their socialized projects, their centralization, their tariffs, their government schools, their state religions, their free credit, their bank monopolies, their regulations, their restrictions, their equalization by taxation, and their pious moralizations. Can you believe that's 170 years ago? It's amazing, isn't it? And now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. This is my favorite line in the whole book. May they reject all systems and try liberty. For liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and His works. Isn't that beautiful? I hope you enjoyed that. If you want more information, please go to teachinghisstory.com. Thank you, and God bless y'all.